All right, well, welcome everybody. EducationUSA Ukraine is happy to introduce another exciting speaker. Today is a great opportunity for everyone to experience how it feels like to be a student in the United States. Today we have a real professor from Drexel University who will be giving lecture just like he would at a university back in the States, talking to his students. So I hope this will be a good chance for you to see how it feels like, to be a Drexel University student or a student in the States. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Lloyd Ackert, who is a PhD professor at the Department of History at Drexel University. And yeah, Lloyd, now the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. This inviting me to present me to the club and through all of you to other Ukrainian students. And I really appreciate the time to talk about both my research and how I use my research in teaching. I apologize for the technical difficulties we're having, and I hope this will all hope it all sounds good. Does it sound okay? It's okay, great. First of all, I'd like to thank EducationUSA in general. You can see them on the first slide. But also I'd like to thank Drexel University and International Admissions for sending me both to Russia, to Ukraine, and to other places to talk to students about studying in the United States and getting to meet, on the last trip, thousands of really interesting students. Okay, let me get to the next slide, excuse me. First time doing this. Drexel University, we can talk more about that later on in the Q&A, but that's the main building, historically interesting, the first building of Drexel University. So what I'm here to talk about today is Sergei Vinogradskii, who, as you'll see, is a kind of a hard person to categorize. Generally, I talk about him in my course in the history of science, which is biographically oriented. That is that I use biography to tell different kinds of stories in the history of science. Students will hear about not only the people, but they hear about their creative process in science. And it's through that biography that I get at what is really important about history, and that is to connect intellectual work with its social, cultural context. And for Vinogradskii, as we'll see, that means not only Ukraine, but Russia, 19th and 20th century science, and France. And then, beyond that, the international community of soil scientists and ecologists. As you can see on the slide, Vinogradskii in this early picture is a handsome guy with a quite wonderful set of mustaches. We'll see some other pictures of him later on. And he is a person who has become known as a famous soil microbiologist, and I'll explain why. One of the more obscure parts of his life and work is his understanding of this metaphor, this concept called the cycle of life, which we'll see he had, it was a holistic view of nature, a broad view of how nature works and is organized, but he got at that through very careful scientific work. And that is through the laboratory study of microbes, both in the soil, in the air, and in the water. So those are some specific themes that I'll talk about, or I do talk about in my course. But the big point, the big historical context that I engage is the history of ecology. And as you see, Eugene Citadino, Gene is a friend of mine, and he is like many historians of ecology who talk about that history as a connection of Alexander von Humboldt's work in plant geography, that is botany in nature, from the 1800s, early 1800s, and they connect it with Darwin and his evolutionary theory in the mid-19th century, 1859 and after. And it's through the connection of Humboldt plus Darwin that we end up with an ecological science that is dynamic, that can explain not only the origin of new species, but the role of organisms in nature. The problem with that common history of ecology is that it leaves out people like Vinogradskii. It leaves out people like Louis Pasteur, at times Vladimir Vernadsky, and many others. And it's because people like Vinogradskii really had no need for Darwinian evolution. They did not have to think about the role of microbes, for example, in nature in terms of competition, in terms of origin of species. And that is some of the work that I will add to talk about later on. So for the history of ecology, Vinogradskii and many others show that you can be an ecologist. You can have a new kind of science of ecology that is not Darwinian. Now, I'm not saying that the Darwinian story is wrong, but rather that this is a new kind of story that can add to it. So I work in biography. I think that biography is an excellent way to get at both the historical context, through personality, and especially through the creative process. Vinogradskii was born to a wealthy family of the landed gentry in Kyiv. I'm sorry, I'm using an older spelling of the name here on the slide. He, as we'll see, was part of a very important family. His father was the founder of the first business bank in Ukraine. His brother, older brother, was a very important musician and eventually the head of the Conservatory of Music there. And Vinogradskii would spend much of his life living in the little town of Gorodok. I'm not sure exactly how far away it is from Kyiv, but I imagine it's not too far from the center. Now, as a young man, he was he had a difficult life, even though he was wealthy. His father died when he was young, and he always felt like he never got good advice for career opportunities. So as a young man, he studied law, which he didn't really like. And he didn't know what to do with his life. He had no good advice, no good mentors. He did decide to follow his life of music. His mother had taught him violin and the piano. So he decided to apply to the St. Petersburg Conservatory, and when he got accepted, moved up to that city. He was married at the time, and I believe had already had one of his 4 daughters. He studied with Leshetizky, who was one of the great new modern pianists, and after 1 year, had to give it up because he did not impress them enough. He was, like they said in his final test in the first year, he was more like a Salieri, not a Mozart. Now, I don't know if anybody knows the history of music. Salieri was quite an important and very adventurous musician, but compared to Mozart, he was not a virtuoso. Vinogradskii had to be a virtuoso. And if he couldn't do it in music, he would go to science. And he decided to go down the road where he would study with some of the great Russian scientists at the time. Ackert was the old father of botany. Mendeleev, I'm sure you're familiar with his name, in chemistry, had worked on the table of elements. This is a time in history, in Russian history, and at this time Russia was not just what it is like today, but rather a combination of many different states, including Ukraine. So Vinogradskii is a man not of the 60s, but of the 70s. So that is, following Turgenev's story, he was a person who needed to take action. He wanted to help improve science and society. And for him, the way to do that was to be through laboratory science in physiology. So he's not going to study chemistry with Mendeleev, who was very old at that time and a star. He was going to study not with Ackert, who was an old-fashioned botanist, but rather with Fominsin, who was his a mentor, and I'll get to him in a minute. In my classroom, I always show the American students, or the students in my classes, how big Russia is. And I want them to understand, if with using this map, this old map, just how extensive the country was at this time. And again, today we have a much different picture of this story. So Fominson was an interesting character because he was trying to do something revolutionary in plant physiology, trying to understand the relationship between all plants and, beyond that, animals too, by looking at nutrition and looking at respiration. And his book, which we'll get to in a minute here, was the great transformation of matter and energy in organisms. Now, when Fominson was teaching Vinogradskii, Vinogradskii was his student, Vinogradskii had to come up with a master's degree program. And he studied wine yeast. He did that in an interesting way that connected not only Fominson's work, but also the great work of Louis Pasteur, the French microbiologist. And that is, he's studying yeast, microbes. And he takes the two pictures you see now. On the bottom is a setup with a microscope and a Geissler chamber. Geissler chamber, you see in the top, is a flattened glass tube through which you could run microbes in the center there, plus you could change the liquid that would flow through. Vinogradskii uses this to study how nutrition affects the growth of microbes. That's his master's work. In his work and research, he reads the ideas of two French chemists, people who studied and followed on the work of Lavoisier, and that is Dumas and Boussingault. Now you start to get a sense of the bigger picture, this cycle of life idea that Vinogradskii would imbibe and study his whole life. And that is, you can see in the quote, it's an idea that the plants absorb materials from the world, from soil, from water, from air. They build their bodies. At some point, they get eaten by animals. The animals use that material to build their bodies. Eventually, everything dies and returns back to nature to be ready to be used again. So this is 1840s that this happens. Vinogradskii would read their work and study Pasteur. But he's working with Fominson, who is a guy who is doing what I just said, the exchange of matter and transformation of energy in nature. It's a way to think about all of life connected through this process. Now, there's Louis Pasteur. What were his ideas? Well, and I should stop here because when I was doing my research, I never thought about the idea of a cycle of life. That was not something I understood as a young person, but I noticed it in Vinogradskii's essay that I'll talk about in a minute. And then I started to see it everywhere. And I don't know if maybe you've seen the movie Pi. It's this kind of low-budget movie. Once you start to see a term, right, you recognize it, you start to see it everywhere. So I started to see the term cycle of life, or cycle de vie in French, or Kreislauf des Lebens in German, and in Russian, Общий круговорот жизни. And so here in Pasteur's work, I start to see it, and for him, it was a chemical view of life. If you go to another person that influenced Vinogradskii, Ferdinand Kohn, the German botanist, it's ewigem Kreislauf, this constant circulation, eternal circulation of matter. But his view is biological. It's about bacteria and microbes. Now, Vinogradskii does his master's work with Fominson. He needs to move on to continue his research, and he decides to go to Switzerland to work, Strasbourg, to work with Anton de Bary. De Bary is a morphologist. You study the nature by looking at the shapes of organisms. And he says to Vinogradskii, here we have this big problem. We need to know, I'm going to move ahead a slide. These organisms are filamental bacteria. I know you didn't expect to come Friday afternoon to hear about these horrible, like stinky sulfur bacteria, but here we are. So the Bari tells Vinogradsky, we need to know why there are sulfur granules inside these little microbes. So Vinogradsky says, okay, I'll work with you. I'll try to figure out in the lab. He goes to the lab. They've got jars of these bugs. And he says, I can't figure it out. These are like old specimens. And he says, here's the tricky part. In order to find truth in nature, you have to go to the source of the organisms. You have to go out to free nature, what Vinogradsky called free nature. What does it mean to be free? In this case, it means that there aren't any human beings around. So he goes up to the mountains in Switzerland where he had a chalet. His family was rich, remember. And he goes on this great expedition and he finds sulfur springs. Now, I don't know if anybody's been at a sulfur spring. They are not beautiful spas. These are places that are muddy and they stink and it's kind of disgusting. So that's his free nature. He goes to these spas, these sources, and he collects fresh bacteria. And he then notices what's happening there. He says, oh, if you notice, these organisms don't actually live on the surface of the water. They don't actually live on the very bottom. They're in the middle. If they're close to where they come out of the mountain, there's many of them. If you go to where the end of the stream is, there's very few. Now, he takes those observations from nature and he goes back to the laboratory where he conducts a number of experiments like this one. Excuse my drawing, I'm not a very good artist. And he takes a very simple array, which is a glass slide and a glass cover slip with a drop of water in it. And he notices that inside there, the microbes, as you can see in the dotted line, they don't go right to the edge. They don't go all the way in the middle. That is, they're mediating that space in nature between air and hydrogen sulfide, what this sulfur is. So it was that observation that allowed Vinogradsky to say that one of these great moments of discovery, the microbes are not creating sulfur, they are eating sulfur. And it was the first time that any organism had been discovered through laboratory science to be living on a poisonous substance. Most things need air, most things need organic material. It would turn out over Vinogradsky's next career at Zurich, where he would study nitrogen and iron bacteria, and beyond, that these were a new kind of life, that they were what he called chemosynthesis. Chemosynthetic organisms are things that don't need oxygen, and they also can eat inorganic matter alone. Now, later scientists figured out that Vinogradsky wasn't completely right, but at this time, that's what counted as the new big discovery. So he goes to Zurich, and you can see the same institute where people like Albert Einstein worked. Vinogradsky was there at the same time as he was, but I don't know if they ever met. It was unlikely, probably. And so we'll go on. Now, Vinogradsky's essays, he published 4 or 5 essays in 1888 to 1890. They were very well received, and he became famous. That meant that he got many job offers. Louis Pasteur invited him to come to Paris. And the Institute of Technology in Zurich offered him a job. But Vinogradsky wanted to go back to his home, and this meant to work in St. Petersburg, but also, of course, his home in Ukraine. And so here he starts to work on microbiology. He does a number of things where he's the director of the Institute of Experimental Medicine, where Pavlov worked. He was sent out to the plague fort, Chumnoy Fort of Alexander I, where he studied disease in a very horrible year of his life. But there, in 1896, you can see he published this great essay, just a talk he gave to the Institute on the role of microbes in the cycle of life, where he described this big holistic perspective of how nature works. It's where I was able, as a historian, to connect this big perspective, holistic view, ecological view of nature with his laboratory science. So he chooses to go back to Pasteur, back to the St. Petersburg, where he had worked for about 15 years before he had to give up science because he had nephritis, which was a kidney disease, and he got the influenza. So he really needed to leave the cold north and move to the south, the nice warm climate of Gorodok in Ukraine. And he received many accolades, and he had honorary degrees. And recently, as you can see here in Gorodok, a memorial was created in his honor. I can talk about that at the end. And so he's back home in Gorodok, where he's running his farm. And I was just reading today in his autobiography where he was doing forestry, and he was running the industries on his huge farm, and really expanding the business that his father and brother had created. What happens in 1917? What happens in 1914? The whole world turns upside down. There's civil war. There's World War I. Vinogradskii, to make everything short, has to leave the country. But he wasn't happy about that. They took all his land. His entire huge estate of 1,000 verst was taken by the White Army, by the Bolsheviks. So he's writing in Belgrade. He had to emigrate to Belgrade. And he writes anti-Bolshevik articles where he criticizes Lenin and others for being anti-scientific. And he writes it under a pseudonym called Stary Naturalist, Old Naturalist. And he has a very complicated argument, but I think what this shows, the big picture, is that he thought about society and nature only as a scientist. That was his main way. Now, of course, I'm sure that he had some religious views. I'm unclear about them. He was a real person, so he had personal views. But here I think you can see that he really thought about politics and society as a scientist. He even tried to organize a political party called the Naturalist Political Party. So you can see he was serious. He didn't, it never went anywhere, and he ended up having to leave even Belgrade because he needed to work. Belgrade at that time was not a very good place to do science, and so he asked Pasteur's assistant collaborator, Emile Roux, if he could come to Paris. Emile Roux invites him to set up the laboratory that you see there, where he could study agricultural microbiology. And he would spend the next 35 years of his life there. Now, as a historian, especially as a graduate student in history, I would have been happy to end my story there. But Vinogradskii was not that kind of a person. He was a person who could not stop working. And from the age of 65 until his death when he was 95, 97, he worked and completely did 30 years of new research. What happened? It's very hard to write a biography of a person that lived to be almost 100, by the way. Let's see. Now, Vinogradskii had tried to get back into science by reading the journals of the time. One article by a Russian scientist portrayed Vinogradskii as an ecologist. He said, Vinogradskii's an ecologist just like Louis Pasteur. Now, you can just imagine, maybe, if someone said, you were like Louis Pasteur. It's a great compliment. What Vinogradskii said was, oh, I'm an ecologist, I guess. And he started to rework all of his old work. He started to do new research. And if you see in this image here, like, what is that? This is a picture that he drew and painted, and it's of microbes in the soil. There are several populations and species of microbes there. Vinogradskii says, in order to create a science of soil microbiology, you have to think ecologically. You have to put all the microbes into their natural setting and see what happens when you change the soil. chemically. So now think back to that first experiment he did with Famintsyn, where he has that little setup with a microscope and the slide. He's changing the fluids there to see what happens to the single kind of microbe. Now he's doing it again much later and after a lot of research to not just one species or one kind of microbe, but a whole population. And he starts to advance this work for the next 25 or 30 years, where he develops a whole new series of research that makes the argument that soil science is ecological. It's a long story. I'm not going to take you through the details of the science, but it would be very influential to the rest of the world. In 1949, Vinogradskii published a 900-page review of all of his published work in French. He translated it all into French, and while he was translating it, he did what is probably not acceptable, maybe, but he presented all his old work in the view of his new ideas of ecology. So he said, in 1888, I published on sulfur bacteria. He said, oh, actually, that was ecological. Now, it's not historically accurate, but it shows, I think, us that he's really thinking in terms of this new science. The history of ecology is that it starts in the late 19th century, and by 1920, you have a formal science with textbooks and courses and research laboratories that are ecological, that are ecology. Vinogradskii is adding a whole new dimension to that story by looking at the soil. It's about agriculture. It's about nature in general. And as we'll see, it could be about even the search for extraterrestrial life, not in his own work, but in his people who he influenced. Who did he influence? Well, there's a lot of things going on in Russia at this time, and in Ukraine too, and that is the rise of Lysenko and this political control of science. Vinogradskii was an emigre, so he didn't have to participate in that. But while that is happening, we can talk more about that later, he starts to influence some of the Russian scientists who did survive that and who were working in sciences that weren't impacted directly by Lysenkoism in genetics. People like Vladimir Vernadsky, the great biogeochemist, Theodosia Stobzhansky in genetics, who had emigrated to the United States and also had a population view of nature. Where do these people come from? They come from Ukraine, Podolia. The people who he influenced also, I'll show you, Selman Waksman. René Dubos was French, but all the others seem to be coming from Ukraine, especially in the Podolia region. So I could talk more about them in a minute, but I want to continue to the rest of the story here. So Jakob Lippmann, Selman Waksman, and other people at Rutgers University in the 1920s and 30s adopt Vinogradskii as the father of soil microbiology, their great hero. They are all Ukrainian Jewish emigres who had come to the United States during times of difficulties in the early 1900s. But that's not the only place. In England, you had the Rothamsted Agricultural Station, where the Dutch would continue his work. The English in the Dutch Republic, the people who worked with Beijerinck, one of his competitors, Martianus Beijerinck, the Delft School of Microbiology, challenged Vinogradskii's ideas and adopted them. It was a very important time. Vinogradskii's a rare student. He did not have a giant school of accolades or students, but one was important. Vasily Amyelansky, who would take over Vinogradskii's institutes and develop them further. And as I mentioned, Vernadsky, who had this great view of biogeochemistry, of the biosphere. He incorporated Vinogradskii's work of soil microbes into that and said that Vinogradskii was a great innovator and helped him to understand the world in a holistic way. Now, when I got into the project, I had no idea that this would be a French story. In fact, one of my colleagues here, who is a historian of Russia, he even teased me a bit and said, oh, Vinogradskii's not Russian or Ukrainian, he's French. Of course, he was wrong. Just because you end your life in a certain place doesn't change the place you grew up, right? So, but this is the contemporary pictures of Vinogradskii's laboratory in Brie-Comte-Robert outside of Paris. On the top, you can see the laboratory. In the back, the little house, the little castle is where the house where they lived. It was a 40-acre farm, experimental farm. And in the third picture on your, I believe, right, is the gardener's house where a lot of the plants were raised and the farming was actually done. So these pictures were taken at a time of a great celebration in Brie-Comte-Robert. Here you can see the town historian with my friend Bernard Vedry. You can see Bernard with his wife, and they're standing next to a sign. The bottom picture in the center is the mayor of Brie-Comte-Robert. And you can see the laboratory again. This was all part of a big conference on Sergei Vinogradskii today, and it was a celebration of French soil and water microbiologists about their great hero. Let me see what else I have here. What's important? The occasion was that they named a street after Vinogradsky. It was right across the street from his laboratory, and it was a wonderful time for science. The local residents, however, were upset because their street now was a very complicated thing to write on an envelope. And so they complained to the mayor, who said, well, that's too bad because we have to recognize this great scientist. So let's just go back to a slide here about impact. Who is Vinogradskii and what is his story then? I think it's a story that is about a person who lived a very long and exciting life. I've only given you a very small story about his life and work. In that story, we have this wealthy person who devotes his career to what is cool at the time. That is science. Science is like poetry in the 1880s. Science is going to change the world. When the world does change, and it drives Vinogradskii away from his home and his wealth, he has to fall back on the one thing that will help him identify himself as a human being, and that is his scientific research. At the end of his life, when he could be just relaxing and playing the piano, which he played his whole life, to have his daughters around him, living in the French countryside, he spends every single day in the laboratory studying microbes that you can't see with your normal eye, right? That you have to use microscopes and chemical processes to study. He's got this big, beautiful picture of the world that everything is logical and interactive and complex, but yet also simple in this grand view of life. And he gets respect because all of a sudden around the world, people are saying that Vinogradskii is important. Even in the later period of his creative life, he's coming up with new ideas and work and being influential. So the history of science, he helps us to understand a history of ecology in a way that without him, you couldn't do it. For myself, I get to study a person who I think is maybe not at all times the most pleasant person. There are many stories of him being quite angry at people, but yet a creative person who discovers new things. Does that in concert with a broad intellectual international community. And that has always been very fun for me. Not to mention that, as you can see in the slide, I got to go to live in France for 7 weeks and study in very nice environments. In conclusion, I'd like to say thank you again, both to Jim McLaughlin, who is sitting in the room here hearing the lecture, to the Education USA and Natalia Etten for arranging this lecture. And I'd like to turn it now to discussion. If you have any questions, and hopefully I can hear you and we can figure all that out. So thank you for coming to this. Natalia?
Natalia? Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for the great lecture. Can you hear us now, Lloyd?
You just fine. I should when I enter in classroom, I don't sit down behind a wood panel. That I stand up and I wave my arms around, and so that's what you would get normally.
Yeah, thanks. We got it, but this is also a new way, I guess, for us to have lectures, seeing our professor on the screen rather than in the room. But I hope the students enjoyed this. Don't you agree, guys? Yeah, is that okay? Well, do you have any questions? Maybe questions to Dr. Lloyd about anything that you've heard through the lecture, specific things about Drexel University that you would like to talk about? If you can introduce yourself and then maybe come closer here. So,
My name is Olga. I have a question. Can you please expand on the notion of the cycle of life? Do you hear me?
What I think is important about my work is that the cycle of life is a view of life that a number of scientists adopted in the late 1800s and the early 1900s to explain a nature as a inter-organized body of organisms. That is that it is logical. It makes sense. Organisms have a particular role to play, and if they didn't do that work, then nature wouldn't work right. That is, if you didn't have a microbe that could eat cellulose, plant matter, then plant matter would accumulate, and we'd all be covered in plant matter because nothing was eating it. Now, in the old days, 17th century, people like Linnaeus, the Swedish botanist, had the same view. But for him, it was a religious view, a divine view of nature. It didn't stop him from doing excellent science. He was able to do both at the same time. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, you start to have this view in chemistry and in biology that was a little less religious. Now, they are still religious people, but they are starting to say, okay, religion can be over here, and science can be over here. And in Ukraine and in Russia and in Europe in general, people are starting to do that in a way that was never done before. Science then, people like Vinogradskii who come later, can say, okay, I don't have to worry about religious explanations. I can worry about scientific ones. But yet, he still uses that term, the cycle of life. Louis Pasteur uses the term, Kohn, many, many others. Is that a religious worldview? Is it a scientific worldview, or some kind of a mixture of the two? And I would say that's what's happened, is this big, broad religious view of nature. Remember, it goes back to Judeo-Christian literature. From the earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, goes back to earth. This is a process of, right, an ancient view of nature. Now, in the 20th century, in science, we don't want to talk about religion. It became, well, that's not appropriate. In your publications, you're not going to talk about this. But still, you can see these reflections of an older belief. We have to have these broad perspectives, these views of nature and of life that help us to understand our work. Now, I'm not saying that all these people are secret, religious thinkers. They're not. But what I'm saying is that history can show us that what was once a religious view, maybe it's Buddhist, maybe it's Indian or Chinese or Christian, becomes eventually, sometimes, a very powerful way to think about the world using modern scientific ideas. How's that sound?
Yeah, that sounds cool. Actually, there was if looking back to Christianity, there was a Middle Ages philosopher, Thomas Aquinsky, who proved with an absolute conscious the God. So he said that everything is so logical in nature and the cycle of life. So maybe this is ruled with some, godness.
I think if you go to the past, that you can really start to see how people were doing that, especially in the Middle Ages and early modern period. And if you could send me an email with that citation, I'd really like to look at that and send me the person's name. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. No problem.
Cool.
Anybody else?
I wonder, Lloyd, how did you get interested in the history of ecology, and what was this first interest that got you so excited about the work of Vinogradskii?
So I'll tell it in brief. In 1979, I know you don't think I'm that old, but I am. I joined the United States Air Force, and my job was to learn Russian. And so I studied Russian language during the Cold War, and I flew in the back of an airplane along the Russian border. In 1983, I got out of the military, and I went to college, and I had Russian language skills. So I met a colleague, a historian and philosopher of science, who asked me to work on the Theodosius Dobzhansky, the Ukrainian and then later American geneticist. And it was through that work that I became interested in history of science, where I always kept my Russian interests, language, culture. And remember, at that time, Russia, Ukraine for Americans were more or less the same kind of system, and it was during the old Soviet period. When I went to graduate school, though, at Johns Hopkins University, I should back up. I was an aspirant at the Academy of Russian Sciences, Russian Academy of Sciences, and I studied at St. Petersburg University in the 1990s. But after a few years, I went to Johns Hopkins University to complete my doctoral research. It was there that I studied history of Russian science, history of science in general. But when it came time to pick a topic for my PhD thesis, I went through a list, and my advisor wrote it in alphabetical order or in Russian. So it was, I think it was Bekyetov, and then it was Vinogradskii, and then it was Dokuchayev. And so I didn't want to work on Bekyetov, but I liked Vinogradskii, and I had no idea who he was. So I did some research. I found out Vinogradskii was a microbiologist. It was fascinating to me. And at that time, I had no idea it was a story about the history of ecology. I read all his scientific work, and no cycle of life, no ecology. Then I found his unpublished essay on роли микробов в общем круговороте жизни in 1896. And I said, what's the cycle of life? And that led me to a whole new interpretation of Vinogradskii's scientific work, of his life, and to this idea of the history of ecology. So that's how history works. It's serendipity, it's luck, it's chance. But it's like Louis Pasteur said, it's luck that is guided by work and research. The trained mind has luck in a more narrow way than in general, right? If you buy a lottery ticket, you have general luck. If you're a microbiologist, you have luck when you find a new discovery, maybe. And so that led me to this whole new story, and all my publications now are about the cycle of life. My new book is going to be about a big history of the topic, and that's how people understand me in my own field. It also helps me to teach, and students find this to be a very engaging topic. And I teach courses for undergraduates, but also graduate students, and how to be more in a more advanced course on courses like I call it global ecology. And it's a great course that goes from Linnaeus all the way up to people like Lynn Margulis in the United States, the Gaia concept, but also people like Vladimir Vernadsky, who was very influential on her and that work. Long answer to a good question.
Perfect, thank you. I wonder if there are any more. Oh.
I would like. I'm really excited to be a part of this, and I had wanted to present to you in person, and you could see my arms waving around even more. But my flights were delayed in the last trip, so I hope that next year that I can come and visit you and meet you in person and talk to you about my work, about your work, your interests, and about Drexel University. If that's okay, Natalia.
That's absolutely okay. We're always happy to see you anytime you have a visit to Kyiv. We'll be excited to interact with you more and hear more about your work. So thank you very much, Lloyd, for your time. Are there any more questions? No more questions?
All
right.
Has anybody been to Gorodok?
The Gorodok? No. I don't even know where it is, quite frankly.
Because that's where the memorial is, and Natalia Kolotneva is the person who was working on Vinogradskii, and some doctor commissioned this museum to him there. So someday I'd like to go visit it.
Well, maybe next time you're in Ukraine, you'll be able to arrange the visit, and we will be with you to help you translate. How about that?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
See you soon.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Lloyd. So I will turn off the recording right now.